And we're really privileged to have with us today Dr. Eva Moskowitz and Jason Bedrick, two of the real leaders, not only in the ideas of education reform, but in actual hard, difficult practice of education reform in the country. I think the premise behind this session in particular is threefold. First, that school reform is possible, that it's actually possible for entrepreneurs to build and act and to make a difference, both in the political arena and in building schools. And we're going to hear a couple of real concrete examples of real success stories in the education debates. The second is that education reform matters for all of American society. So much of this effort, and rightfully so, has been been driven by the desire to help kids who are trapped in terrible schools. And what could be more tragic than trapping good kids in bad schools, and what could be more welcome than creative ideas to help them, and all for that. But I think the education reform debate is also about the future of our civic institutions, including our religious schools. And where there's been a rescue mission in many ways for underprivileged kids, perhaps they need to be thought also. The whole education reform debate is a rescue mission for religious schools, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, that need the resources of the state. Our frax dollars liberated in order to support the kinds of educational institutions that many of us want to send our kids to. And the third premise is that there's a variety of different approaches to education reform: charter schools, vouchers, tax credits, education savings accounts. And this entire variety of strategies ought to be considered, explored, pursued, and debated state by state, locality by locality, and at the national level. So those are the premises, but really it all amounts to the people. And I'm really privileged to introduce Eva Moskowitz and Jason Bedrick as our panelists today. Eva Moskowitz, we don't know each other well, so this story is something you never heard. But at Tikva, we educate a lot of young students, college students, and many of them want to be civic entrepreneurs. They want to do something good for America. They want to do something good for the Jews. They're looking for models of real achievement. And they asked me, so who's a model? And I've thought a lot about it over the years, but in truth, Eva, you're the model that I put before them. As someone who, animated by an idea, has built something remarkable. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, but there are now 14,000 students. Am I about right? More 15,000. See, you sleep for a couple of weeks, who are being educated in the Success Charter Academy's school system, and it really has become a school system. Out of nothing, she's built something remarkable. She has a PhD in American history from Johns Hopkins University. She served for many years on the New York City Council, but she has been one of the national leaders and real models of excellence in the entire education reform effort. And Eva, we're really privileged to have you here today for this conversation. Our second speaker, another great friend of Tikva's, is Jason Bedrick, who is another person who's gone into the arena with good ideas to try to improve and strengthen the fabric of American education today. He has a master's from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and then decided at 27, 28, to run for the New Hampshire state legislature, where she, 23, okay. You must be younger than I thought. And won. And one of his main ambitions in doing so was to try to make the case for school choice in New Hampshire and around the country. Since then, he's been the head of two education policy divisions at two of our most important think tanks, the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and EdChoice, where he's the head of education policy. And he's been instrumental in many states, especially most recently in Arizona, where he lives, in passing very important education reform efforts. So each of them will speak for 20 minutes, Eva first, and then Jason, and then we'll have plenty of time, I hope, for questions and conversation. Eva, it's a great privilege to welcome you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Oops. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear? Good. Well, thank you very much, Eric, for having me. I thought I'd begin by just giving you a little more background on the project. So we began Success Academy. I'm the founder and CEO. I began in 2006. And I didn't start as a school choice advocate. I was neither influenced by Milton Friedman or a commitment to a certain group, religious or otherwise. I actually am a FDR liberal. I believe in equity and access. I also believe in excellence. And public education in this country used to be the envy of the world. I grew up in New York City. I went to Stuyvesant High School. I saw for myself that it was no longer the envy of the world. And I set out to try and do something about it. I'm sure many of you remember when the New York Times had an A section and a B section. Is everybody old enough for that? So I thought the issues on the A section of the New York Times were really hard to solve. Peace in the Middle East. It seemed that the issues in the B section of the Times should be solvable, and public education was one of those problems. So I ran for office. I wasn't as successful as you were the first time. I lost the first time. And then I became the chairwoman of the Education Committee. And I held over 125 hearings, doing my best to improve the system. I thought, how come we can send a man on the moon? Couldn't we have a really strong, good, free public education system? Along the way, I started sort of veering from that path. Many of you may know George Klein was one of my constituents, and he asked, well, could we, since the public is not paying for religious school, could at least we get computers the way the parochial school, the Catholic parochial school system did? And I found it very strange because we paid for nurses and we paid for textbooks, but we somehow drew the line against everything else, including computers. And I was the first member of the city council to say, wait a second, why shouldn't we make capital allocations? Let's make capital allocations to both religious schools and private schools. And I spent about 7 months working with the comptroller. And when I was a member of the city council, that was the first capital allocation to religious schools. No one really much knew that I had done that, so I wasn't yet an enemy of everyone. But my journey to school choice really came less from ideology and more from practical confrontations with the system. I held hearings on every conceivable subject: art education, music education, literacy, science, procurement. And it was really hard to improve this system. No matter how many hearings I held, no matter how many government officials I subpoenaed, I couldn't make much of a difference. One of my last hearings was on toilet paper. The then operating budget of the New York City school system was $15 billion. It's now, by the way, $31 billion, that is annually. But at the time it was $15 billion, and I thought, well, surely a system that is spending $15 billion every year should be able to get toilet paper into the New York City school system. And I began to really think about the monopoly of public education. And no matter who the chancellor was, the system remained more or less the same. And even though I am now, hasn't done me much good, but I'm the leading expert to this day on why there is not toilet paper in the New York City school system, I cannot say that I got toilet paper into the school system. And I became really pessimistic about our capacity to improve the system. Meanwhile, literally hundreds of thousands of children were being sacrificed to this system. Now that we spend $31 billion every single year, and by the way, that doesn't include the capital budget, I would estimate that 90% of our kids go to schools that fundamentally don't work. And what I mean by not working is pretty basic, meaning the schools do not teach the children to read or count. And that's a pretty expensive price tag for something that is profoundly dysfunctional. So that's how I became a school choice advocate. And I no longer make the distinction between, many of my colleagues in the public charter sector are not pro-tax credit, they're not pro-voucher. I'm not sure they would be pro-charter if they didn't run charter schools, but regardless, it's a fairly narrow view of parental choice. And I take a very broad view of our need to support school choice in all of its breadth and glory. But I started Success Academy in 2006 with 165 children, K and 1. I am now the 7th largest school district in the state of New York and #1 in student achievement. We have outperformed Scarsdale, Chappaqua, Upper East, Upper West, and we've done that with a couple of fundamental design elements that are, somewhat old-fashioned, but I think truisms. We believe that parents have to have skin in the game, and it can't just be about educators. Our kids are admitted by random lottery, but we spend an enormous amount of time talking with our parents about the sacrifices that they're going to need to make in order to achieve a level of excellence. And we say to our parents, we're never going to ask you to make sacrifices that we are not willing to make ourselves, but we're not going to put our children in a position to compete globally unless we're willing to make those sacrifices. We also have an incredibly rigorous curriculum. In most American public and private education, I would argue we've gotten very intellectually soft. What we think kids are capable of has been lowered very significantly over the years. And if you look at the mathematics in this country compared to the mathematics around the world, we're 2 or 3 years behind. And even then, it's very, very procedural. You don't see kids being asked to engage in mathematical proofs, for example. You don't see kids really dissecting high-level poetry. You don't see them doing challenging scientific experiments. So one of the ways we've gotten these results is really by upping significantly the rigor level. In order to grow this kind of massive system, and we're at 46 schools, 15,000 kids, our goal is to get to 100 schools of extraordinary quality, which would mean we would be educating 50,000 children every year and be somewhere in between the size of the Boston and Atlanta school system. Now, all of this has been done at enormous, I don't know if I can say political cost, but at every step of the way, everyone seemingly has fought us. Certainly no one rolled out the red carpet. We have been sued by the teachers union, NAACP, and various alphabet groups that are associated and funded by the unions. We have had elected officials at every turn try and stop us. And so it has involved an enormous political fight. So I believe ed reform is possible, but it's not going to come easily. And it's not going to come without an incredible engagement in our political process. The special interests are too powerful, too entrenched for that to happen. But we've won, knock on wood, God willing, all of the lawsuits against us. The mayor of the city of New York has been utterly hostile to everything we've tried to do at every turn. We brought 11,000 parents a number of years ago to Albany. Andrew Cuomo and the state legislature saved us. If you've been reading the papers recently, I'm in another battle with the mayor. Our elementary schools are graduating kids, and he does not want to provide this space for middle school. one of the ways to crush the charter sector in New York City is through real estate. And so that's the mechanism that tends to be used against the charter sector. But I am very optimistic that we can win this battle much more broadly than charters if we are politically active. That is the only way, I believe. You know, people in the charter sector initially thought that the merits were going to win the argument. And I had seen the teachers union up close and personal. I had never felt that I had lived a Godfather movie before doing so. And I never believed that the merits alone were going to win the battle. Of course, you need excellence, because that's the whole point of offering choice, particularly to disadvantaged students. But excellence alone is really not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So on a regular basis, I am mobilizing parents. In the last 2 weeks, we have done multiple press conferences on the steps of City Hall. We've done a phone to elected officials. De Blasio is particularly unhappy with me at the moment because we are patching calls through to him on a regular basis. But this is the kind of thing you have to do if you want very sensible public policies to prevail. So I'm excited to be at this point, even though it's difficult. I think the next decade we're going to see more choice more quickly than we've ever seen before, because I think parents are voting with their feet. Last year we had 17,000 parents apply for the random lottery. Unfortunately, we only had 3,000 seats to offer. So we had 14,000 kids, or 28,000 parents, go home empty-handed. And those parents love their kids just as much as the parents of the kids who won the lottery. And I think that parents simply aren't going to accept a failed public school system. And whether you come at this from a religious perspective or not, we believe in this country in choice. It is a pretty foundational concept, and I think at the end of the day, that will reign. Thank you very much.
First, I'd like to say what a great honor it is to speak at TICFA. TICFA is an institution that challenges us to engage with serious ideas in seemingly unserious times. And so its efforts are necessary, I think, now more than ever. They say a Mensch tracht and Gott lacht. I've been excited to participate in this for many, many months, and then woke up a couple days ago with no voice. So I'll do my best here. It's also a great honor, by the way, I should say, to share a podium with the great Dr. Moskowitz, who is a personal hero of mine. And it's just, I'd explain why, but you heard her speak already. She has had tremendous success fighting the good fight, and she's got the scars to prove it. So that's an honor. From the very beginning of our emergence as a people, the people of the book, Jews have taken extraordinary care concerning the education of our young. The great former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, is fond of pointing out that Moses is known as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. On the eve of the exodus from Egypt, he points out, moments before the liberation from centuries in the house of bondage, Moses spoke not of freedom, not of the long road ahead, not even of the promised land, but rather he enjoined the Israelites to educate their children. As Rabbi Sachs so eloquently explained, to defend a country you need an army, but to defend a civilization you need education. Freedom begins with what we teach our children. That is why Jews became a people whose passion is education, whose heroes are teachers, and whose citadels are schools. Nowhere is this more evident than on Passover, when the entire ritual of handing on our story to the next generation is set in motion by the questions asked by a child. In every generation, we need to cultivate afresh the habits of the heart that Tocqueville called the apprenticeship of liberty. The Talmud credits Yeshua ben Gamla with saving the Torah among the Jewish people and preventing it from being forgotten. What did he do? At the time, it was primarily incumbent upon fathers to pass on the traditions and teach their children the Torah. But what of children who are orphans, or the children of the illiterate? So Ben Gamla established that in every community, they should provide teachers for children beginning at the age of 6 or 7. In other words, the sages of the Talmud recognized that Jewish continuity depended on realizing the vision of universal education. During 2,000 years of exile, living as strangers in strange lands, often under the sovereignty of nations hostile to Jews, Judaism, and Jewish values, we survived because of the supreme value we placed on education, transmitting door to door, generation to generation, the Torah, our traditions, our values, and the accumulated wisdom of millennia. And yet in the present day, some parts of the Jewish community have all but abandoned immersive Jewish education, while other parts are struggling mightily to provide it. We know the difference that a day school education makes. Research from Brandeis and other institutions find that regardless of denomination, students who received a Jewish day school education are significantly more likely to be involved in Jewish campus life when they get to college, identify as Jews later in life, marry Jewish, express a greater commitment to the Jewish community, become involved in Jewish organizations, donate to Jewish causes, support Israel, pursue communal careers in Jewish communal services, and so on. And yet only the Orthodox have embraced day school education in large numbers. According to the much-discussed 2013 Pew report on Jews in America, more than 80% of Orthodox Jews enroll their children in a full-time day school, compared to only 30% among conservatives, less than 10% among Reform, and just 3% of Jews who say that they have no religious affiliation. Among these latter Jewish groups, it is not hard to draw a line directly from the lack of immersive Jewish education to the grim portrait that the Pew report paints in terms of assimilation, intermarriage, and lack of communal involvement. But although the Orthodox, by and large, are immersing their children in Jewish education, many are struggling not to become submersed by it. Ask almost any American Orthodox Jew what is the most pressing issue facing his or her community, and they are likely to tell you the Jewish day school tuition crisis. The Orthodox community is straining under the weight of paying for two school systems, their own and a secular system from which they cannot benefit. The financial strain is a great deal more than just foregoing luxuries. As Rabbi Aryeh Kapler has pointed out, there is a moral cost as well. Families choosing for financial reasons to have fewer children. Parents taking second jobs or working longer hours, thereby depriving them of almost all weekday contact with their children. Transforming in some communities nearly half of households from community contributors to charity recipients, who are often subject to an intrusive and even humiliating examination of their personal finances by the day schools. Telling children who aspire to intellectual, creative, or helping professions that these are not viable options for them because they will not produce enough income to sustain a committed Jewish lifestyle. The burden of paying for the day school education can reduce or even undermine the effectiveness of schools to achieve their goals. As Rabbi Kapler writes, if our children lack Jewish passion, doesn't that bespeak personal exhaustion? If they are materialistic, isn't this related to their being told that their career paths are limited because they are poor? When they show signs of being at risk, doesn't this reflect lessened parental involvement? How can children internalize the core Jewish value of human dignity and the spiritual value of financial independence when their schools are making them dependent? Private, communal, and philanthropic efforts to address the situation are as praiseworthy as they are necessary, but they are not sufficient. Making private education affordable for all families will require tapping into the resources that the broader society has already dedicated, at least in theory, to ensuring that every child has access to an education. If Jewish continuity is, as it should be, a core Jewish concern, then supporting educational choice programs, vouchers, tax credit scholarships, education savings accounts, should be among the Jewish community's very top domestic priorities. Expanding educational choice is not only good for the Jews, it is good for society at large. Nearly all of the random assignment studies, the gold standard of social science research, have found that students who receive school vouchers perform as well or better than their non-voucher peers on standardized tests. Numerous studies have also found that school choice raises the rate of high school graduation and college matriculation. And some recent studies even found that it reduces the probability that a student will later be arrested or convicted of a crime. For example, in Washington, D.C., 91% of students participating in the Opportunity Scholarship Program graduated high school compared to 70% of the non-voucher control group. Parents of D.C. voucher students were more likely to rate their schools as safe and orderly and to express overall satisfaction with their chosen school. Incredibly, the voucher program achieves these results at about a quarter of the cost of the district schools, about $7,500 compared to nearly $30,000 per pupil that they're spending in the DC public schools for what are rated as among the worst schools in the country. Moreover, so don't let anybody tell you, oh, we just need to put more money in the system. Washington, D.C. says that's not the case. Moreover, using data from the U.S. Department of Education's evaluation of the Washington, D.C. voucher program, researchers calculated that for every dollar spent on the program, society reaps $2.62 in benefits from increased tax revenue, lower incidence of crime, and reduced dependence on public welfare. But the benefits to society are more than merely financial. Numerous studies, which you can find summarized by Dr. Patrick Wolf's essay, or rather his research literature review, civics exam in educationnext.org, finds that choice programs tend to produce citizens who have greater civic knowledge, who are more likely to volunteer and engage in the political process, and crucially, exhibit greater levels of political tolerance. Indeed, a recent study by Dr. Jay Green, published by the American Enterprise Institute, finds that private school students were significantly less likely to hold anti-Semitic views. But it's not just about the test scores. It's not just about these other empirical findings. Educational choice is about something much more fundamental than that. It's about empowering parents to choose their child's learning environment. We are a diverse society, but political systems are zero-sum. They create winners and losers. A political system of schooling pits parents with differing ideas about education against each other to have their own values reflected in the schools. Often that means the majority imposes their values on the minority. In some cases, it means that a well-organized and politically powerful minority imposes their views on the majority. But very often, what it means is that we have a least common denominator system of values. It means having schools that are almost value-free, if not to say value-less. A free and pluralistic society should have an education system that respects and reflects that freedom and pluralism. That's why educational choice is good for the Jews and good for America. Unfortunately, we've made tremendous progress in the last 25 years, but there's still a long way to go. School choice in America dates back to the town tuitioning programs that were enacted in Maine and Vermont in the late 1800s. But the first modern school voucher program was enacted in 1990 in Milwaukee. And apparently I don't have page 6. Well, I'll continue. Since then, we've enacted about 60 school choice programs in about 30 different states plus Washington, D.C. Now that sounds like a tremendous amount of progress, and on one level it is, but it still represents less than 1% of the total students in the entire country. And those students are receiving less than 0.4% of the funding. So whereas we are making huge strides, and I think we are almost at the point we are approaching a tipping point when it comes to school choice, what we're lacking is great numbers. But there are a few exceptions in a few different states. So first of all, Florida, which has the largest tax credit scholarship program in the country. There are 100,000 students participating in Florida's school choice program. Those students are, by and large, low income. The average family income is $25,000. 80% of them are Black or Hispanic. And research finds that students that are entering the program tend to be among the most disadvantaged students. On test scores, they score much lower than their public school peers, and yet once in the program, they're performing, even though they are among the lowest income students in the country, they are performing at the national average. One of the genius things that policymakers in Florida did is, though it started as a very small program, they included a 25% escalator. So through the miracle of compound interest, it can grow dramatically over time. Another state that is pioneering is Arizona, my adopted home state. In Arizona, you have, it was the first state to adopt a tax credit scholarship back in the 90s, now the first state to adopt an education savings account. Now, education savings accounts, or ESAs, are not like the Coverdell or 529 plans. What we're talking about in this context is sort of like a voucher where the government takes the money that would, or a portion of the money that would have been spent on a child at a particular school, and they put it into an account that that child can use in private school. But with the voucher, you can only redeem, if it's $5,000, you redeem that at one school at one time. With an education savings account, that money can be used for tuition, but also tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, educational therapy, and any funds that you have remaining at the end of the year can roll over into the next year. So much greater freedom in that sense to educate your children. Arizona's program, enacted about 5 years ago, was originally only for students with special needs. Since then, they've expanded it a number of times. This year, they expanded it to all students that are either entering kindergarten or first grade or switching out of a public school. And over time, they're phasing it in until all students are going to be eligible. And just a couple years ago, Nevada also enacted a universal eligibility or near universal eligibility education savings account program. But as Dr. Moskowitz points out, with great success and any attempt to reform the system, you're going to produce a backlash. So there have been numerous lawsuits that were filed all across the country against these school choice programs. We've been winning most of them. In Nevada in particular, they had a lawsuit against the program. Defenders of the program won on every single issue except the funding mechanism. So they said, yes, this program is completely constitutional. There's just $0 in it. And the legislature flipped hands before they had an opportunity to fund it. It's still on the books. It's not funded. So there are thousands of students on a waiting list that have applied that want to benefit from it but cannot yet. In Arizona, where we just expanded it to universal, the opponents were able to gather enough signatures to put it on the ballot as a question next fall. So we'll see what happens there. But again, they were able to slow down the progress of the program. And in the last few years, opponents have managed to block very ambitious reforms in states as different as Texas and New York. In both of these states, tax credit scholarship bills passed the Senate, had the support of the governor, and in theory, if you believe the members of the assembly, there was enough votes actually to pass it out of the assembly, but the Speaker of the House in both these states, one of the reddest of the red and the bluest of the blue, refused to bring it up for a vote. You may be shocked to learn that the teachers' unions give both of those speakers a great deal of money. That said, I am very hopeful. Opponents can only slow the spread of educational choice. They can't stop it. Once parents exercise choice, they don't give it up willingly. Moreover, polls consistently show that younger Americans are much more supportive of these choice programs than previous generations. For millennials, every single aspect of their lives is customizable, except this one, where you're assigned a service based on the home that you happen to be able to afford. It's completely incongruous with everything else that they experience, and I don't think it can continue like that forever. So universal choice is a matter of when, not if, although here in New York, the when might be a while. So what might all of this mean for the future of Jewish education? As the great philosopher Yogi Berra once said, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. If the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's that we have no idea what is possible. So with that great mountain of salts, friends, let us reason together, or at least speculate a bit. The first possibility is that educational choice will mean just more of the same. The existing system will continue on looking pretty much as it currently does, with school choice programs helping to fill empty seats or even expand enrollment in the existing models without much changing in the near term. And in the near term, that is indeed what I expect. If so, in the immortal words of Eliza Hamilton, Dayenu, that would be enough. If day school parents were less strained, if they had more children and they had more time with those children, Dayenu. And it's not just a relief for parents. A day school principal that I spoke to recently said that if he had a program like this, he would spend a lot less time fundraising and a lot more time in the classroom helping the teachers educate the children, which really is, he sees as his fundamental purpose. I also expect that we'll see migration, especially in the Jewish community, to states that have more robust school choice programs. So we're already starting to see this. A few months ago, the Cleveland Jewish News reported that some Jewish schools in their area had increased enrollment by about 33% in just 5 years due to an influx of new families, which they said were coming primarily because of the voucher program and affordable housing. And a representative of Agudath Israel told me that when people call them about relocating to Cleveland, the voucher program is usually the first thing that they ask about. And according to a principal at a Jewish day school in the Phoenix area, said a decade ago, most of the Orthodox kids in the area either went out of town for a high school or they even went to a local public school. But now, thanks to the tax credit scholarship program, about 90% are staying in town for going to a full Jewish day school. So again, if that's all that educational choice accomplishes, Dayenu. But it's not just about the Orthodox, it's about all Jews. And it's not just about affordability, it's about educational excellence and variety. Changing the way we fund education opens up new possibilities for Jewish education entrepreneurs to scale up and to reach new audiences. For example, we've already seen the immersions of Hebrew immersion charter schools, such as the Ben Gamla schools that are operating around the country. They teach Israeli history and culture, but while they can have a Zionist bent, they can't really teach Jewish values, or let alone Judaism, because charter schools are public schools, and public schools must be secular. They can teach the history of the Hanukkah story, for example, but they can't teach the miracle of Hanukkah. So I think it's missing something fundamentally important. With vouchers or education savings accounts, however, these schools could operate as private schools that could teach Judaism, and therefore I think they could reach more families that want more than just Israeli culture. We may also see the proliferation of Jewish classical education schools. For example, Mainline Academy in Pennsylvania provides a rigorous and interconnected education in the Western canon that takes children on a journey from the biblical period through Greece and Rome and the Renaissance to the modern day. And along the way, children study primary sources at a very high level, from Sophocles to Shakespeare. And since they learn both Hebrew and Latin, students can read the Torah and the poetry of Virgil in their original. So again, if that's all we're to accomplish, Dainu. But in the long run, I expect much more. I expect we'll see significant changes from a system of choice, a system in which institutions are free to innovate and develop organically according to the Hayekian process that in another room Yuval Levin calls experimentation, evaluation, and evolution. In such a system, education providers are free to try new ways of doing things. Families evaluate their performance based on their lived experience, and the entire system evolves based on those families' preferences. Even the teachers' union boss, Albert Shanker, infamously conceded that our district school system operates more like a Soviet-style planned economy than a free market. By contrast, a system of educational choice would make it easier to create startups, to find new ways of educating students, and to scale up successful models. We don't know from the outset which direction it will go, but it's highly unlikely to remain unchanged for very long. One major and perhaps overdue change is likely to be a move away from seat time, or what's often called the factory model, in which students are assigned to a grade level based on the year that they happen to be born, and they are expected to advance across all subjects at roughly the same pace. By contrast, competency-based education advances students only when they have mastered a specific skill or area of content, and often uses technology to do so. Think something like Khan Academy. And technology is also expanding the reach of superstar teachers through virtual learning. A few years ago, the Wall Street Journal profiled South Korean English teacher Kim Ki-hoon, who makes more than $4 million a year, about what the average NBA player makes. How does he do it? More than 150,000 students a year watch his lectures online, for which they pay about $4 an hour, and he spends most of his time responding to students' questions and writing textbooks. So imagine if the top Jewish educators in the world, instead of only reaching a few students in their classroom, or over the course of a day or a week, a few hundred students maybe, were reaching tens or even hundreds of thousands of students. So in closing, we don't know what the future has in store for Jewish education or education more broadly. But if we want a more dynamic and innovative system, and one that aligns with our values, it is essential to make advancing educational choice a top agenda item in our community. To succeed, we'll have to work very closely with Catholics and other Christian groups, conservatives, libertarians, and liberal reformers, for whom this is already a top issue. And we'll have to work to expand the coalition, especially among parents who, while not very political, want more for their children than what the current system currently offers. I pray that we are up to the task. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you both. We should have plenty of time for conversation and questions. Let me just start with one, Eva, to you, which is, can you say a little more about the nature of the political opposition? Meaning, what you've achieved seems so self-evidently good. Could you maybe just give us a little bit of a picture of why there are so many political constituencies that seem to be opposed to this? And then second, thinking just about New York, what would success look like? I mean, what would actually political success in the education reform movement look like over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years as you see it?
Well, I think first is the issue of what does the opposition look like, and in order to explain this, because it's sort of counterintuitive, as you're suggesting, that science 5 days a week or excellent schooling for poor kids would generate this level of hostility and opposition. You know, I devoted a book to this subject because I thought it was so important that people understand what the opposition looks like. But it comes in a variety of forms. It's legislative. So the mayor tried to impose rent in 2014 when he was first elected, and tried to charge us $3,000 a kid, even though the district schools get to use the public school space for free. And we already get significantly less money per child than the district school gets, and so this would be devastating. There's lots of legislation in Albany that comes out that is anti-charter, anti-choice. One of the pieces of legislation that we had to fight has to do with the demographic composition of your school. So 2/3 of Success Academy schools serve the poorest of the poor, and 1/3 of our schools serve a socioeconomically integrated constituent. So we have a school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, we have a school in Union Square, we have a school in Hell's Kitchen. And in New York, if you pick a certain location, you can actually offer a public school that people of various socioeconomics, races, and ethnicities will choose to come to if the school is excellent. And Bill Perkins, who's a senator from Harlem, proposed a law that said that charter schools had to be 90% poor. And that would have eliminated not only 1/3 of our integrated schools, but even our non-integrated schools range somewhere between 80 and 95% poor. So there's legislation, there's regulation. The regulatory apparatus is constantly issuing regulations that harm our capacity to get from point A to point B. And then there's just all of the media attacks. So I'm sure some of you have read stuff in the New York Times about Success Academies. Those hit pieces come directly from the unions. And so we could spend every waking day defending ourselves. And look, our people sometimes do inappropriate things. It's a large organization, but the media tries to paint it as if this is the signature element of Success Academy, even though it isn't. So you're constantly fighting all those forces. I have, today I'm fighting on about 15 different fronts on a daily basis, and we have a war room and a team of people. That's all they do every day in order for us to be able to educate children.
So what would success look like legislatively?
Well, I could shut down the war room. That would be nice. And I could focus on the very challenging issues of quality, extraordinarily high-quality education, and scaling. Scaling is a very, very challenging, reimagining what that all looks like. But I think success would be broader than that. It would really be that educational choice, parental choice was part of the vernacular of New Yorkers, and people wouldn't be asking, they'd be asking about the quality of schooling rather than the type of school. It's never made sense to me that the service mechanism or delivery system is the question. It seems to me, are all Americans excellently educated? And if we had that debate, I think we would find a variety of solutions in that question.
So, Jason, how do you answer the church-state challenge? Meaning people who simply say, look, I understand your arguments, but I simply object in principle to the idea of public dollars being used to support religious schools that are going to promote ideas and ideals that I don't think are right.
I mean, first there's a constitutional question which has already been answered, right? So that sometimes this is formed I think this violates the separation of church and state. Then there's the philosophical question. I'll address the constitutional question first because that's easier. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled more than a decade ago in Zellman v. Simmons-Harris that there is no violation of the Establishment Clause because the funds are flowing not directly from the government to private religious schools. They're going to parents. Parents have a choice. They can choose among secular schools, they can choose among religious schools. So nobody is being compelled to go to a religious school. The program itself has a secular purpose, and the government doesn't mix in when it comes to parents' choices, any more than, let's say, somebody who was receiving food stamps. They could use that for the Passover Seder. If somebody, for example, had a Section 8 apartment, subsidized apartment, and they had a minyan every day, government says, no problem. The secular service that they're providing is food, shelter, education. If you personally want to mix in religion, that's your own business. The government can't force you, but neither can they prevent you. The program has to be religiously neutral, neither favoring nor disfavoring religion. If somebody says, though, I don't want my tax dollars going to a school because it teaches religious ideas, I mean, fundamentally what they're saying is in line, actually, with Thomas Jefferson, who says that to take somebody's money in the form of taxes and put it toward a use with which they disagree is tyrannical. I think there's something fundamentally American about that. But let's not stop at religion. Let's go all the way in that case. And there are many taxpayers who disagree with the values that are taught in the public schools. So if that's what we believe, is that nobody should be forced to pay for a school system that they don't agree with, then anybody that says, I object to what's being taught in the public schools shouldn't have to pay taxes to those public schools. Now, of course, we're not going to go down that road. So I think the fair system is that if we decide collectively as a society that we're going to pay for education, that the dollars should follow the child, and that the parents should have the right to use those dollars at schools that align with their values. Either everybody gets to have their values represented in their schools, or nobody does. I think that fundamentally, I think, would be much more fair than the system that we have now, which dates back to the late 1800s animus toward Catholics. The state of New York used to directly fund religious schools, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. But when Catholics started coming over here in large numbers, the Protestant establishment said, you're bringing rum, Romanism, and rebellion. And the Know-Nothings mounted a campaign led by U.S. Senator James Blaine from the state of Maine to amend the U.S. Constitution to prevent money from going to parochial schools or sectarian schools, which is a thinly veiled euphemism for Catholic. Now, what they said was, our schools, which are now the common schools, which, by the way, were non-denominational Protestant schools. They taught the Bible, just the Protestant version of it. They led prayer in school, just in a way that any Congregationalist, Baptist, or Episcopalian would be happy with, but not Catholics. So they said, you're welcome to send your children to the common school. It's for everybody, and we'll be glad to Protestantize your kids for you. And if you want to run your own Catholic schools, that's fine too. It's just our tax dollars aren't going to go toward it. Now, they were unable to amend the U.S. Constitution, but they did successfully amend about 40 state constitutions with these things called the Blaine Amendments. So this whole idea, I think, is rooted in something that is fundamentally un-American and bigoted. And we should move back to an earlier concept of religious pluralism and religious freedom, which means that everybody, the government supports everybody to have their own values represented when it comes to the education of their children.
But what about the idea that America's public schools exist to form American citizens, and that there's something misguided about the promotion of sectarian religious schools of various stripes, when part of the purpose of a public school is to deepen the American civic identity of our students? What do you say to that argument?
Right, so I'd say there's theory and there's practice, right? So first, in theory, that's wonderful. But in practice, that hasn't been how it's worked. You know, as if those of you who went to the Gary Bauer seminar earlier today, when he asked the question, he said he's traveled around the country, asked kids to finish this sentence: "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and they're unable to do so. We've seen numerous studies that show how few children can name, high school students can name the 3 branches of government, and so on and so forth. So the civics, I think, are abysmal in the government-run school system. And again, to my point earlier, this review of the research literature shows that private schools, by and large, are outperforming the public schools when it comes to teaching civic knowledge, instilling civic values, and in particular political tolerance, which is something we could use a lot more of these days. These were the same sorts of arguments that were leveled against the Catholics more than 100 years ago. The Catholic schools are producing students that are much more tolerant and much more civically engaged than their public school counterparts. So I think it's simply not true. And Thomas Jefferson said something, I'll butcher the quote, but yes, politically, united we stand, divided we fall. But he said, when it comes to religion, united we fall, divided we stand. That in this country, we recognize that if you try to force one sort of idea, it's not going to work, that we have a pluralistic system. That's a system of political and religious tolerance, that everybody has respect for the values that each other have, even if they don't share it. And so that's why I said earlier, I believe that our school system in a free and pluralistic society should reflect that freedom and pluralism by allowing parents to choose the schools that reflect their values.
So I want to open it up in 1 second. So there's a mic roving around. But Eva, I'm just curious, do you actually teach the Bible in your schools? And do you think that that's a legitimate thing for a public school to do?
We do not.
You have enough problems.
We have enough problems. I mean, and there are many ways to teach the Bible. It is not, it's unfortunate only because it's hard to understand Western civilization, for example, without an understanding of the Bible. But I do have enough problems. So even though I love art history and would like our students to understand some of the references, we don't.
Okay, so let's open it up. Well, everyone has a question. That's good. My only request is twofold. 1, please say your name and where you're from. And 2, ask a question that has a question mark at the end and try to be as succinct as you can so we can get as many people in as possible. So the mics will roam. Go ahead. We'll just work our way backward here.
Your students are chosen by random lottery. I have read in the media, and don't believe it's true, but would like to know how you handle children with special needs, such as learning disabilities. I have read that they've been pushed out. Is that?
That is utterly false.
Good.
About 20% of our children are children of special needs.
And do you have specially trained teachers for them?
We do.
Thank you for coming. Quick question about budgeting for charter schools, and some of the places that have done it, like Milwaukee or even Florida, don't even come close in size to the New York City education system. And that's minus all the kids that are in yeshivas, your system, Catholic schools, and other parochial schools within the New York City area. What would be the size of the budget if they were to add all of these children that they're now not paying for, that they're going to have to start paying for, and where would this money come from?
Well, I don't have at my fingertips the number of children that might want to go to religious schools in New York City, but I can tell you that $31 billion is an awful lot of money, and we're not educating the kids that we're serving. So I really don't think money is the fundamental issue here. Money should follow the child, and it should be equal. Why would you have a different amount for a child in a district school or a public charter school or, frankly, a parochial school? It's really a question of public policy. Are we going to,
I agree with you, but I'm just saying, the big argument is, where is this money coming from? We do have to have an answer when speaking with the other side, of where is this money coming from?
Well, that argument cuts in different directions, right? Imagine what would happen to the public school budget if the Catholic school system or the yeshiva system in New York suddenly went out of business. Meaning there'd be an incredible influx of students into a public school system that would, you know, have significantly, significant pressure on the budget, so.
Overnight.
All right, let's take some more, thank you.
This is a question for Dr. Moskowitz. I'm curious if you have a perspective as a self-described FDR liberal about why the school choice argument has made so little progress among people who obviously, you know, most of them who are not just, you know, very savvy union members, who have a sort of a concern, like motivated by egalitarianism for the kids who get dealt the worst hand in life. Why the school choice hasn't been seen as sort of something that could promote social justice and better social outcomes for people who are given a sort of a bad hand in life.
well, I'm not sure I have a full explanation, but look, the title of this conference is a little scary to people who are liberals like myself, right? I don't consider myself a conservative. I'm here because of ideological consistency, and I think that's underrated. Look at our president. So it's really hard to be intellectually consistent. And look, it took me a very long time, not so much out of fear, although, you know, being a Democratic elected official in New York City, when I came out against principal tenure, I was a persona non grata. That was a huge third rail of politics. You know, I remember very distinctly, and I was fortunate, everyone should have a husband like mine who in high school was for vouchers. I almost didn't date or marry him because of that. But I remember, you know, discussing food stamps. I was very involved in issues of hunger in New York City, and I was an advocate of food stamps. And my husband said to me, well, what is the difference between a food stamp and a voucher? And I gasped, oh my goodness. This is going to be a real problem for me, policy-wise and in terms of my love life. So you know, I think it requires really evolving and thinking about it. And I think there's a little bit of Hatfield's and the McCoys tendency. You're on the team of, you know, a certain kind of social welfare perspective, or you're on another team, and God forbid you should cross over in one area. There's just a tremendous amount of pushback. And just to be really clear, my political career was ended because of the positions that I took. So it's not like there's no cost to doing so. And there really wasn't. You know, I can ask the question the other way: where are the conservatives? You know, they're not supporting liberal Democrats who are willing to be for tax credits, vouchers. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, it goes both ways. Where are folks who should be based on social justice with you, but where is the other side when people stick their necks out? You know, people stick to their tribe.
Some of them are.
Some, yes, and there are exceptions, and that's really admirable, right? But I think it's few and far between.
As I mentioned to Dr. Moskowitz before we started, our daughter she's by the way, our resident liberal in Denver, Colorado. And she, like you, feels very strongly about her or liberal values, she calls them. But she also found, as the Assistant Commissioner of Education when she was in Colorado, that most of the support that she got as she tried to push for charter schools and innovative learning and digital learning was from the right, was from the Republicans. I know that the mayors in this city that supported these programs before were Republican, as was Jeb Bush, which mentioned before about what happened in Florida. So are you finding that most of the support that's being for these kinds of programs are coming from the right and that we can't get the left to come around, or am I generalizing?
Jason, what are you seeing around the country, and then Eva, what are you seeing in New York?
There's certainly a lot more support on the right, right? That's I think, undeniable. But I wouldn't rule out, I wouldn't dismiss the support on the left. I think that's been absolutely crucial. And in particular, it tends to be low-income minorities, right, that very, very much are in favor of this. The Education Next poll, which is run by Harvard University, consistently finds that the groups that most support school choice options are blacks and Hispanics, by far. In Florida, yes, it was Republicans that enacted the program at first, and it was a very politically contentious debate, but it's been expanded since then several times with a high degree of Democratic support, and in some cases, almost all of the support from the Black caucus and the Hispanic caucus. All right, so they recognize that, yes, there are Democratic Party politics. There's the teachers' unions that exercise a lot of influence there, but these constituencies, especially when mobilized, right before the state Supreme Court last year was going to take up this issue, the supporters of school choice held a rally on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, headlined by Martin Luther King Jr. III, who I suspect is a Democrat. And there were a number of leaders there. Even though the national NAACP came out against school choice programs, local NAACP leaders, many of whom were pastors, who had religious schools operating in their community that were serving 90% Black and Hispanic students, they came to this rally, they spoke in favor of it. There were more than 10,000 people there in Tallahassee. So if we want this movement to grow, it has to be a bipartisan movement. Yeah.
What do you see in New York?
I would agree. It has to be a bipartisan effort. Children are not Democrats or Republican, or they're both. But I would just say that we have in New York really flipped the visual narrative of who are the advocates of choice. So we had 17,000 parents marching across the Brooklyn Bridge, and you couldn't say it was a conservative right-wing conspiracy because of the visual of who was there and who was pounding the pavement. And we have run at Success a very concerted elected official outreach advocating for policies in Albany and locally, and it's been quite effective.
Mr. Schimmel, right here.
The underlying assumption about religious education is that the values that are going to be conveyed will be benign. And what do you say to those who say, suppose the religious values that might be promoted will be less than benign in terms of what they teach their children as it affects other groups? For example, in England, where all education, religious and otherwise, is more or less funded by the government, there have been recent reports of Islamic education promoting jihad and hatred of Jews and others. What limiting principle, if there is any at all, would there be to government oversight over what is actually communicated or taught value-wise that might get resistance from those who say they shouldn't interfere with religious education?
I lean in favor of freedom. I think no matter what policy that you are going to implement, there's going to be some trade-offs. I err on the side of freedom for this reason. Do you really want the government deciding what is and isn't benign? And I've heard the jihad school example raised here in this country. I mean, it's almost inevitable in the conversations that this question comes up. I've yet to see the jihad school here. I think it's almost a red herring. And one actually interesting phenomenon is this. There's a recent study, it was just published in the Journal of School Choice, that looked at the backgrounds of terrorists. And what they find is that by and large, they are not coming out of the Muslim schools. So it seems that they're usually actually secularly educated. So it seems that the Muslim students that grow up with a Muslim education and are confident in their Muslim identity in the West tend not to be the ones that are recruited. It's the ones that grow up without a Muslim education that then later in their life are looking for something that are then radicalized by people telling them this is what Islam really looks like. So I think the opposite is true, just statistically. And this, by the way, was something that was a replication of a study that had been done in, I believe it was Denmark. So statistically, if you're looking for a Muslim community that is more tolerant, what you want is Muslims who are actually educated as Muslims.
But more generally, what regulatory oversight should there be of schools that are eligible for vouchers or other kinds of public funds? Should there be any oversight at all? Should they have to teach math? Should they have to teach reading and writing? Or you're in favor of a real libertarian system?
I mean, there has to be some very, very basic, right, reading, writing, arithmetic, that sort of thing. I don't want the government getting involved in content. I don't want them saying you need to teach things in this particular order or these particular subjects. Within, you teach math, but I don't want them saying teach these particular math concepts. That would work if we knew that if there was one best way of educating, and we knew what it was, and we were confident that the government would get it right. And I think all three of those assumptions fail. So I think that the systems of choice have proven to outperform, or just at least perform as well or better than the existing government-run system. So I don't think that we're in any huge danger of having mass illiteracy or anything like that if we move over to the system. Parents want what's in the best interest of their kids. And I think by and large, they're in a better position than the government to make these sorts of decisions. Now, I want systems that are going to empower parents with information. My organization, for example, is providing a grant to Step Up for Students, which is the scholarship organization in Florida that's providing scholarships for more than 100,000 students, to create an online platform where they can see all of the different education options, schools that are in their area, but also tutors and all sorts of textbooks and whatnot that they can buy online. Not just a platform to buy those things, but also data about the school's graduation rates, test score performance, and also, like Yelp or Amazon, empower parents to provide information, reviews of these different education service providers or content providers based on their lived experience so that other parents are walking into it with open eyes. So I think that's a system where we empower parents to choose and then give them the tools to make informed decisions is a much better system than relying on top-down government control.
So let's take a couple more before we adjourn.
You're talking about parents, that's my question. Parents, you talked about integrating parents. I know of a high school in the Bronx where they pay parents to come to PTA meetings and they can't always get them to come anyway. So what do you expect of parents? How do you get them to do it? What happens to the kids whose parents just don't?
Well, we spent a lot of time up front explaining our model, and we're very transparent about what the school design is and what it's going to take. And so before you enter the lottery, after you win the lottery, we spend a lot of time on what the model is and why it works and what the expectations are. Now, the expectations are actually fairly basic. You need to bring your child to school every day they're not sick. You need to bring them to school on time. You can't sign and say the homework is done when it's not done, and you need to return our phone calls. That's pretty basic, but that is not what you have in the New York City school system. Something as basic as parental non-responsiveness is endemic. Now, of course, in the New York City school system, you can't reach the school either. So it's not a reciprocal relationship. Every single parent, those 15,000 parents, my husband doesn't like this very much, they all have my cell phone number. Not because I am going to personally answer every phone call, but it's part of the culture. It's like a customer service orientation that you should be able to get to the top of the food chain if you've tried to get your problem resolved at every level of the organization. There is no customer service in the New York City school system. There might be an individual principal who is very customer service oriented, but the system does not believe, and they don't believe that the parents are the most fundamental unit of what we're trying to accomplish. It's actually profoundly disrespectful to parents. And by the way, if you're poor, you can't just leave work and come to a meeting. So the school has to be willing to have meetings on Saturday. All of our teachers have cell phones. Every parent has every cell phone number of every employee at Success Academy. And we have a rule that employees must return the phone call within 24 hours, and parents must return phone calls within 24 hours. And you would be amazed at what a difference that makes in order to be able to successfully educate a child.
We'll give out your cell phone later for people's kids or grandkids who need help with their physics homework. Okay, let's take two more from the back right in a row, and then we'll give each of our panelists a last thought.
Thank you. My name is Rabbi Yerucham Silva, go to Israel of America, and I have the misfortune of spending a lot of time at Albany working with sometimes very reluctant legislators. As Jason mentioned, a number of years ago, there was a very, we had a closely, almost had over the top the education tax credit. We were just close and just didn't quite get there. Since then, there's been pushback, particularly in the Assembly, from Assembly members, including up as far as a speaker, about various attack ads being run against members of the Assembly. Our group personally was not involved in any attack ads, but they kind of lumped together all those groups that are involved in any kind of school choice, charters, tax credits, were kind of all lumped together. My question, maybe Dr. Moskowitz, as a veteran of New York political wars, maybe, and I'll get actually either one of you, do you see running these ads as counterproductive, or should we really more focus on member-to-member and building support blocks within the legislature?
So one more, then you both can have a final thought.
I don't think I can opine generally. I can tell you that you have to have a strategy, and you have to be really, really disciplined about the strategy. So, depending on what you're trying to accomplish and what the obstacles are, your strategy is going to vary. But, the opposition will give any excuse for why it didn't, a particular initiative, and I doubt that was, having been pretty involved in that battle as well, I don't believe that is the explanation. But we have to be very, very cunning about how you get from point A to point B, and what worked one year doesn't necessarily work another year. You can bet that the unions are very, very deliberate in their political strategy. They run ads. Nobody seems to complain when they run ads to be against tax credits or against testing or any number of public policy issues. So I wouldn't go down that rabbit hole. I think, the movement needs a larger political strategy, and it needs money to execute it, and it needs to be really, really disciplined about it. We really believe in ground up as well as top down, and it's got to be very, very disciplined, because the opposition, they're not playing. And so it's not going to work if it's sort of loosey-goosey.
Last question.
I was going to say, first of all, Dr. Moskowitz, one of the only reasons I've stayed a Democrat is so I'll have an opportunity to support you in the primary when you run for either mayor, governor, whoever. So I did want to say that I remember 12, 14 years ago watching this city council person do the absurdly crazy thing of actually speaking sense in Bedlam. And I wanted to congratulate you for that and say thank you. And then you went on and continued to actually do something in the city. I guess I don't have the optimism that you have, and I wonder how you get up every day and fight the beast. And do you really think that in New York, the city that is Bedlam, really, truly, that we can actually have a school system that serves the kids?
I do. You know, we went from, it took us 18 years in the charter sector to go from 0 to 100,000 kids. I think it's going to take us 4 years to get to 200,000 kids. But it's, you know, it's slower than I would like. I would like all this to have happened yesterday. And it really requires getting the, you know, a cross-section of New Yorkers involved in it. So, you know, I think it's really frustrating that most New Yorkers do not understand that we're spending $31 billion a year to miseducate most New York City children. And if they actually walked into, pick at random, a New York City school and saw the lunchroom and saw what was going on in classrooms, I think most people are caring about kids and opportunity and access. I think they would be pretty horrified that that's not what they thought they were paying for or signed up for in terms of what's in the public interest. So, and I don't think the massive failure at scale is sustainable. So when people ask me, well, you know, how are you going to chip away at it? And I do see myself as taking a sledgehammer to the Berlin Wall. I do think that competition and choice are going to win out in the end, mostly because I have faith in parents. I think given the opportunity, most people have the mama bear or papa bear instinct, and if they have an alternative, they will find it.
Jason, the last word.
So exactly to that point, when people talk about school choice programs, right, there's a tendency, especially among the opposition, to compare it against some imagined ideal. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it. We should be comparing these proposals against the actual reality that Dr. Moskowitz is operating in, right? So to say, well, you know, not all parents are going to make good decisions, that's certainly true, but when a parent makes a poor decision, it affects, you know, his or her family and their child. When a bureaucrat makes a poor decision, it affects an entire system. And I think on the whole, parents are going to be doing a better job. So we shouldn't let the other side say, school choice isn't a panacea, and I agree it's not. School choice isn't going to take us to utopia, and I agree it won't, but it's better than the existing system. And that, I think, is the true comparison that we should be looking at.
Jason, Eva, thank you very much.
Thank you.